Paul never blamed money. He blamed a relationship with it. And the distance between those two ideas is not a minor theological footnote. It is the difference between condemning a tool and diagnosing a disease. You have almost certainly heard the phrase, money is the root of all evil. It is one of the most quoted lines in the English language. People put it on posters, repeat it in arguments, use it to justify suspicion toward anyone who earns a living. But here is the problem. That sentence does not appear anywhere in Paul's letter. Not in the Greek. Not in the earliest manuscripts. Not even in the King James Version, which gets closer than most people realize. What Paul actually wrote is built around a single Greek word, a compound that fuses two ideas into one. The word is Philarguria. It is made of philos, meaning love or affection, and arguros, meaning silver. Not money in the abstract. Silver. The physical metal that first-century hands exchanged in markets, dropped into tax collectors' pouches, and stacked in temple treasuries. Paul did not write that silver is evil. He wrote that the love of silver is a root of evils. And once you hear what that compound word actually carries, the entire warning changes shape. To understand what Paul meant, you need to see where he placed this word. It appears in his first letter to Timothy, chapter 6, and it does not arrive out of nowhere. Paul has been building an argument for several verses, and the target of that argument is not wealth itself. The target is people who treat the faith as a business strategy. Look at what comes just before. In verse 5, Paul describes certain teachers in the Ephesian church who have corrupted minds and who suppose that godliness is a means of gain. That last phrase is critical. The Greek word for gain here is porismos. It refers to profit, revenue, the kind of return you calculate after an investment. Paul is describing people who look at the gospel the way a merchant looks at inventory. They teach, they preach, they take positions of influence, but their underlying motivation is financial. Then Paul does something unexpected. Instead of simply condemning these teachers, he redefines the word gain. Verse 6 says, "But godliness with contentment is great gain." He takes their commercial vocabulary and turns it inside out. Yes, he says, there is real profit in the faith. But the profit is not silver. The profit is a quality of the soul. Contentment. The Greek word is autarkeia, and it means self-sufficiency, the condition of needing nothing beyond what you have. In Stoic philosophy, this was one of the highest human virtues. Paul borrows the concept but roots it in something different. For Paul, contentment is not about inner detachment from the world. It is about trust in a God who provides. Then he gives the reason. Verse 7. "For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it." This is not a proverb Paul invented. It echoes Job chapter 1, verse 21. Job, after losing everything, said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart." Paul is reaching back into the oldest layer of Hebrew wisdom to make a point that should have been obvious. Wealth is temporary. It does not arrive with you. It does not leave with you. It belongs to the interval. And verse 8 draws the conclusion, "But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that." Notice how minimal the standard is. Not comfort, not security, not a retirement fund. Food and covering. Paul is not prescribing poverty. He is establishing a baseline below which anxiety about money becomes spiritually dangerous. Above that line, anything you receive is surplus, a gift, something to steward rather than something to grip. Now watch the temperature rise. Verse 9 shifts from instruction to warning, and the language turns violent. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. The verb Paul uses for plunge is bouthizo. It means to drag to the bottom, to sink, to drown. This is not a gentle metaphor about spiritual decline. This is a man describing people going under, pulled down by the weight of what they wanted most. And notice again, Paul does not say, "those who are rich." He says, "those who want to get rich." The Greek phrase is hoi boulamanoi plutein. Boulamanoi implies deliberate, considered intention. This is not a passing wish. It is a life orientation, a decision to organize your energy, your relationships, your faith around the accumulation of more, The problem is not the bank account. The problem is the posture of the heart. That brings us to verse 10. And here Paul reaches for a word he uses nowhere else in any of his surviving letters. Rizagar panton ton kakon estin he philarguria. Let that word order register for a moment, because it matters. In English, we naturally place the subject first. We say, the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. But Paul puts riza, root, first. He leads with the image, root. That is the first thing you hear. Before you know what the root is, before you know what it produces, you are already underground, already thinking about what is hidden beneath the surface. The emphasis is architectural. Paul wants you to feel the buried origin of visible destruction before he names it. Then comes the subject, he philarguria, the love of money. But that English translation, though functional, flattens something important. Philarguria is not just love of money the way we might say someone loves pizza or loves their job. The philos root in Greek carries the idea of deep personal affection, attraction, fondness. It is the word embedded in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. It is the word behind philanthropia, love of humanity. It is a relational word. It describes not just desire, but attachment, a bond. And the second half of the compound, arguros, does not mean money in general. It means silver. Literal, physical, metallic silver. In the first century Roman Empire, silver was the economy. The denarius, the basic Roman coin, was a silver coin. When a laborer received his daily wage, it was silver in his hand. When taxes were collected, silver changed hands. When Paul wrote arguros, his readers did not think of a number on a screen or a concept called capital. They thought of the gleam of a specific metal, the coin they could feel between their fingers. So philarguria, taken apart and laid open, means something like this: a deep personal affection for the silver in your hand, not merely wanting more of it, being attached to it, bonded to it, oriented around it emotionally the way you might be oriented around a person you love. And this is exactly why the popular misquote is so damaging. When people say, money is the root of all evil, they make the object the villain. The silver itself becomes the problem. But Paul's word makes the relationship the villain. The silver is neutral. What is not neutral is what happens inside you when silver becomes the thing you are most devoted to. Paul was not even the first writer in the ancient world to make this connection. Centuries before this letter, the Greek philosopher Diogenes, the famous cynic who lived in a barrel and challenged Alexander the Great, reportedly declared that the love of money is the mother city of all evils. He used the word metropolis, literally the mother city, the origin from which colonies are founded. The idea that affection for wealth was the generative source of human corruption was already circulating in the Greek intellectual world. Paul did not borrow the phrase from Diogenes, but he was working in a culture where this kind of moral analysis had a long history. What Paul did differently was ground the warning in a specific theological context. This is not a philosopher's observation about human nature in general. This is a pastoral warning to a church leader about what happens when people inside the community of faith let silver replace God as the object of their devotion. Now, there's an important debate about this verse that we need to address because it affects how strong the claim actually is. The KJV translates the phrase as, "The love of money is the root of all evil." Most modern translations, including the NIV, ESV, and NASB, render it differently. The love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Two changes. The root becomes a root, and all evil becomes all kinds of evil. The difference matters. In the Greek text, the word riza appears without the definite article. There is no "the" in front of root. That is why many modern translators render it as a root, suggesting that the love of money is one source of evil among several, not the single origin of every evil act ever committed. This makes grammatical sense. Pride, jealousy, hatred, and fear all produce evil without any connection to silver. However, this is not as settled as it might appear. The absence of the article in Greek does not always mean what the absence of "the" means in English. Greek regularly drops the article in proverbial or maxim-like statements without making the noun indefinite. When Jesus says in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 12, "I am the light of the world," the word light in Greek has no article either. No one translates that as, "I am a light of the world." Context determines whether the article matters, and context here points toward a sweeping, emphatic statement, not a cautious qualifier. Paul has been building toward this line for 5 verses. He is not hedging, he is diagnosing. The second change from all evil to all kinds of evil comes from the phrase panton ton kakon. Panton can mean all in the absolute sense, every single instance, or it can mean all kinds of, every category. Most modern scholars favor all kinds of because the absolute claim that every evil in history traces back to the love of money seems too sweeping. It is true that some evils have nothing to do with money, but again, Paul may not be making a philosophical catalog of every sin ever committed. He may be using the kind of emphatic, proverbial language common in Jewish and Greek moral teaching. The point is force, not exhaustive taxonomy. The love of money is not merely one problem among many. It is a generative source that produces evil in every direction. Here is what this means practically. When the misquote says, "Money is the root of all evil," it gives you an external enemy. Money is out there, and it is bad. The solution is avoidance. Stay away from it. Be suspicious of anyone who has it. But Paul's actual word, philarguria, points inward. The danger is not in the metal. The danger is in your affection. And you can have almost no money and still be consumed by philarguria. A person with $10 who thinks constantly about getting 20 is gripped by the same root as a person with 10 million who thinks constantly about getting 20 million. The disease is identical. Only the scale differs. Paul knew this because look at the context again. He was not writing to wealthy investors in Rome. He was writing to Timothy, who was leading a church in Ephesus, a city with an enormous temple economy, yes, but also a city full of ordinary working people. The false teachers he described in verse 5 were not necessarily rich. They were people who saw the church as a means of gain. They wanted to get something out of the faith. Their problem was not that they had too much silver. Their problem was that silver had too much of them. And Paul chose this specific word carefully. He did not use pleonexia, which is the more common Greek word for greed or covetousness. Pleonexia appears in several of his other letters, including Colossians and Ephesians, and it means the desire to have more, the appetite for excess. It is a broad, acquisitive word, but philarguria is narrower and more intimate. Pleonexia is about quantity. Philarguria is about devotion. Pleonexia says, "I want more." Philarguria says, "I love this." And that distinction is devastating because you can fight a desire for more through discipline and restraint. But how do you fight a love? A love reshapes your identity. It reorders your priorities without your permission. It makes you see the world differently, and that is exactly what Paul is warning about. The rest of verse 10 confirms this. After naming philarguria as the root, Paul describes its fruit, which some, reaching for, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. The word for reaching for is origomenoi, and it implies straining, stretching, extending yourself towards something just beyond your grasp. It is the posture of someone always leaning forward, never satisfied, never arriving, and the consequence is double. First, they wandered from the faith. The verb is apoplanao, which means to be led astray, to be deceived into taking a wrong path. Second, they pierced themselves. The word is periaperon, and it means to impale on all sides. It is violent and self-inflicted. No one did this to them. They did it to themselves. This is the anatomy of philarguria. It begins as affection, it becomes orientation, it produces restless straining, and it ends in self-destruction. Paul is not describing a moral failure that happens in one dramatic moment. He is describing a process, a slow reorganization of the heart around silver rather than God. And the result is not just sin in the abstract. The result is grief, literal, felt, embodied sorrow. Now here is where the word becomes pastorally explosive. Paul places this warning inside a letter that also tells Timothy what kind of leaders the church should have. Earlier in the same letter, in chapter 3, verse 3, Paul lists the qualifications for an overseer. and one of those qualifications is the word philarguros. Not a lover of silver, it is the direct negative form of the same root. The prefix a negates the compound. A church leader, Paul says, must be someone who is not characterized by Philarguria. This is not an incidental requirement. It is built into the architecture of church leadership. If the love of silver is the root that produces evil, then the leader of the community must be someone in whom that root has not taken hold. And in the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 13, verse 5, the same word appears again. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have. The writer uses aphilarguros and then connects it immediately to contentment, the same virtue Paul linked to true gain in 1 Timothy 6, verse 6. The New Testament is remarkably consistent on this point. The problem is never the silver. The problem is always whether the silver has become your philos, your beloved, the thing to which you are most deeply attached. So what changes when you recover Paul's actual word? Three things, and they matter enormously. First, the diagnosis moves from external to internal. The popular version, money is the root of all evil, invites you to look at your bank account. Paul's version invites you to look at your heart. Do you love the silver? Not do you have silver? Not do you earn silver? Do you love it? Is it the thing that makes you feel safe? Is it the thing whose absence terrifies you? Is it the relationship in your life that most determines your mood, your decisions, your sense of identity? Philarguria is a mirror, not a ledger. Second, Paul's word protects the goodness of provision. When you misquote the verse as money is the root of all evil, you imply that material provision itself is suspect. But Paul explicitly told Timothy that God provides food and covering and that this is sufficient for contentment. Later in the same chapter, in verses 17 through 19, Paul addresses people who are already rich. He does not tell them to throw their wealth away. He tells them not to be arrogant about it, not to place their hope in it, and to be generous with it. Wealth is a tool. Provision is a gift. What is not a gift is the condition of loving the tool more than the giver. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Paul's word reveals that the deepest danger is not a behavior, but a bond. You cannot fix Philarguria by giving away your money, though generosity may be part of the treatment. The real issue is the attachment itself. The real question is what you love most. And this is why Paul contrasted Philarguria with autarkia, contentment. Contentment is not the absence of desire. Contentment is what happens when your deepest affection is placed somewhere stable, somewhere that does not corrode, somewhere that does not lose value overnight. Paul's argument is not stop wanting things. Paul's argument is stop giving silver the loyalty that belongs to God. The word philarguria appears exactly once in the entire New Testament. Paul used it in this one passage and never returned to it, but its impact radiates outward through the whole letter. It explains why false teachers are dangerous, not because they teach wrong ideas, though they do, but because their wrong ideas are funded by the wrong love. It explains why contentment is great gain. Not because contentment feels nice, but because contentment means your affection is directed at the right source. And it explains why the popular misquote is not just imprecise, but actively misleading. Money is the root of all evil gives you someone else to blame. The love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, asks you to examine what you are actually devoted to. 2,000 years after Paul dictated this letter, the misquote still dominates. It is on coffee mugs, in movie scripts, in political speeches. And every time someone repeats it, they do exactly what the misquote itself enables. They locate the problem outside themselves. Money is bad. Rich people are corrupt. The system is the enemy. But Paul's compound word, built from love and silver, refuses to let you off that easily. The root is not in the marketplace. The root is in the heart. And the only question that matters is the one Paul's word forces you to answer. What do you love most? If the answer is silver, the root is already growing. Subscribe for more investigations into the original language, history, and context behind Scripture's most familiar passages.